Sorry, but I'll leave that for now. Okay. Step down. And the argument that I made was in some ways saying that what we're seeing in what happened in Egypt and in Tunisia, the fact that it was peaceful, massive, non-ideological, of people standing for freedom and human rights, is so overwhelmingly positive that it's exactly the anti-Bin Laden, that it is exactly the kind of nightmare that Bin Laden has, exactly the type that his groups weren't able to do through violence and ideology. And therefore it should be embraced. And the opposite side of that was that if, in fact, we don't allow it to succeed, if, in fact, it fails, if, in fact, people don't achieve what they want, it's going to turn into Egypt's and the world's and America's nightmare. And I want to develop that a little bit in a minute, because I want to come back to the question of so how I read what's happening in the region. Just a couple of things about the Congress and the administration. I think there was a sense at some point that the United States really is not going to be able to determine the outcome in Egypt. There are obviously a lot of people who are also saying we should determine the outcome in Egypt. But there was also a sense of the limits of American power, and therefore the idea that the US should try to engineer an outcome was not one that is likely to work. And so I think the instinct of the Obama administration was to support the will of the people. And while it looked like there was a time when they appeared to waver a little bit, particularly when Frank Wisner came here and made a statement, that really was not, and genuinely was not representative of what that administration was, but nonetheless gave that impression through that particular process. My worry, by the way, right now, is that we now have a war of narratives about what happened in Egypt and what happened in Tunisia and what may happen, I hope happens ultimately, in Libya, and what may happen elsewhere. Every time that you have a major change on this scale, such as after big wars, 1967 war, 1973 war, or 1948, those are huge dramatic changes, or 1956, the Suez crisis. These create complete strategic shifts in the region. When a big strategic shift like that emerges, superpowers have to calculate how to redirect their policies. These are big times of transition, and a lot of the anchors, the posts that you lay down there as guide for your policies are no longer there. And so you have to figure out what are the new posts for your policies. And I think we're witnessing a period after the United States and other powers figure out how they're going to react to the crisis as they emerge, as they're reacting now to Libya. There will be a sitting back to figure out how to reorient American foreign policy. Therefore, there are so many players who have a stake in that, in terms of not only what America will ultimately do in the Middle East, but in terms of how to interpret what happened in the Middle East, how to redefine it, how to look back and start seeing things that we didn't see or didn't assume. We said it's a peaceful demonstration. Well, you can obviously take the events that happened to a CNN reporter and CBS reporter and magnify them and say, well, it wasn't. You can be graphic about it. We said it's not ideological. You can take a couple of groups who were ideological and you can magnify it and turn it into an ideological war. That is a war of narratives. And I see in Washington, in the coming weeks and months, a war of narratives. We're inside, with multiple groups having a stake in how we interpret events. what actually happened, what it means, what the trend is going to be, and that's going to precede what the US will decide to do. And 9/11, by the way, was an event like that. 9/11, complete shaking up of the narratives. There was a period when there was a war of narratives taking place particularly between 9/11 and the attack on Afghanistan. And the American foreign policy could have gone in 2 or 3 different directions. And one of the directions was, and it was initial instinct of the State Department to say, Al-Qaeda is the enemy of everybody, including the Arabs. And we have a total support in the international community to go against them. Let's just make it about Al-Qaeda, and let's look at causes of anger in the region, and let's address the big issue of the Arab-Israeli conflict. This is an opportunity for a president who's empowered to do something about it. Well, that's not what happened. And there was a war of narratives, and somebody wins and somebody loses in wars of narratives, and there will be a war of narratives already beginning. You have to be mindful of it, you have to look for it. To the extent that there will be a debate and you want to weigh in, the debate will be on a war of narratives and interpreting what actually happened, what are the implications, and how then America or other countries can define their interests accordingly. Well, let me give you my narrative, and that's what I'll end with, which is in terms of how do I read it as an analyst who follows the region very closely, who does annual public opinion polling in the region that we've been doing for a decade, so I have a little bit of a sense of, how public opinion is evolving. And to look at it at a macro level, to look at it not just at the level of what's happening in Egypt, where you can tell me a lot more than I could possibly tell you, but to look at it from as a political scientist looking at a historical perspective at a macro level with the information that I have. I think that it's a mistake for analysts to think that this is about economy of food, and it's a mistake for analysts to think it's simply about a corruption of a regime. We've had those, and they happen, and they're cyclical. And every regime has a life cycle, and the economy matters. It matters a lot. And food matters. I would be the first one to admit that and to look at it in a historical perspective. But there's nothing in the events of the previous year or two that has been so dramatically different from previous years along these lines that can tell you why we have this cycle of empowerment. I think we're upon something far bigger. I believe that we're witnessing a public awakening in the Arab world that is the most important public awakening since the end of World War I. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, it's very sometimes easy to get carried away when you're looking at events, and you're close to them, and they seem bigger in the historical perspective. They don't seem as big as they may be. I say it for the following reason. I say it because in my own studying of the change in public opinion over the past decade, there has never been a question every single year when I conduct the surveys. I've never asked that question, when will people have reason to revolt? That has never been a question, because every single year before, our question was, why haven't people revolted already? And that has been the puzzle for the past 20 years in the Arab world. It has never been about, do they have reason to revolt? We have captured it in every single poll. We've seen the widening gap between governments and publics, and not just on opinion. I mean, when I'm polling in Sunni majority Jordan, and the king is calling Hamas and Hezbollah the enemy, and you ask the Jordanians, name the man you admire most in the world, and they say Hassan Nasrallah, or you say you prefer Fatah and Hamas, and they say Hamas, you have something here that is far bigger than you're assuming. But there's also been a widening gap in identity. And I think the identity gap has been quite astonishing. Even in Egypt, I mean, if you ask people in Egypt 10 years ago, are you first Egyptian or first Muslim, first Arab, assuming you hold these things, it's really a false choice in some ways, because everybody feels that they're Christian or Muslim or Arab or Egyptian all at once. But which one is more important? A decade ago, by far number one was Egyptian. In 2009, 2010, only about a third say Egyptian. And I think there's been a widening gap of identity where the public doesn't identify with the state. And in some ways, the question is when you see your leaders speak, when you hear your government speak, when you interact with them in any shape or form, when they are on television in your own country or outside with another leader, do you say I'm proud to be an Egyptian or I'm proud to be an Arab, or do you want to hide under the table when they're doing things that go exactly against your identity? And so across the entire region, we've been measuring this widening gap of identity where the public is not identifying with the state because it's hard for them to differentiate between state and government. And so we've seen that. So the question has been, so why haven't they revolted until now? And my own answer is really historical, again, based on what we've been measuring over the past decade. And I think what we're really seeing is the delayed impact, cumulative impact of the rapidly expanding information revolution with all its aspects. And I do mean that. And I don't mean it in terms of the internet, people have used it, or the Twitter revolution, or whatever you want to call it. That's not the point. What I'm saying is that there are three aspects to the information revolution over the past decade and a half that have empowered people, empowered the individual in the Arab world in ways the individual has never been empowered in the Arab world. And that is a trend that is unstoppable, it's a force that just simply cannot be ignored. And it's not just in Egypt, it's everywhere in the Arab world pretty much. And that is, the first thing, of course, is that the satellite television has taken away the monopoly of information from the government. A decade ago, when I asked here in Egypt or Morocco, where do you get what is your first source for news? It would have been Moroccan TV in Morocco, Egyptian TV in Egypt. In 2009, I asked them, 2010, where do you get your source of news? The vast majority in the Arab world, as is the case in Egypt, name stations that are outside their own boundaries. Their own station, they're ignoring it, which is another, obviously, in some ways, indication of the separation that was being created. So first, it deprived the government of a very important source of influence, which is monopolizing information. Took it away from people, became dismissive of it. And number two, it opened people to the outside world, particularly with the internet. The links that were created, both in terms of knowing what the outside world has, and two, to know that the outside world is watching and being empowered by the fact that you're interacting with the outside world. The internet expanded things way beyond the regional media. And in the polling that I did, we see an explosion in our world only in the past 5 years. Only in the past 5 years. 5 years ago when I measured the use of the internet in my polls, I didn't have a large enough sample to be able to carry statistically meaningful analysis with attitudes. It only expanded that rapidly. The third thing that I think has came out of the information revolution is the interactive part, which is the ability to coordinate, share information almost instantly, and organize without the need for political parties and leadership as intermediaries. That creates a whole new ballgame, because if you say, why have intelligence services governments fail in places like Tunis and Cairo, there's no question that there was a model of assumption about what does it take to get so many people out into the street. And that model just didn't work. And the model was, well, it can only be